The first thing Oberleutnant Klaus Steiner noticed was the sound. Not the roar of an engine or the screech of tracks, but a sharp, metallic crack that split the frozen December air with surgical precision. The second thing he noticed was that his beloved Panther tank, the pride of the 116th Panzer Division, suddenly had a hole the size of a dinner plate punched clean through its frontal glacis armor. The third thing he noticed, in the fraction of a second before survival instinct took over, was that this should have been impossible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was December 19th, 1944, near the village of Stoumont in the Belgian Ardennes, and everything Klaus Steiner thought he knew about American armor capabilities was about to be violently rewritten. The 32-year-old tank commander had served on the Eastern Front for 2 years, faced Soviet T-34s, and even the formidable IS-2 heavy tanks. He had survived Kursk, weathered the retreat through Ukraine, and carried with him the absolute certainty that German armor technology remained superior to anything the Americans could field. The intelligence briefings had been clear and consistent. American tank destroyers were lightly armored, their guns inadequate against the thick frontal armor of German medium and heavy tanks. The M10 with its 3-inch gun was a known quantity, dangerous to older Panzer IVs perhaps, but hardly a threat to the Panther's sloped 80mm frontal plate. The newer M18 Hellcat was fast but carried the same 76mm gun as the Sherman, powerful enough against lighter vehicles but theoretically impossible of penetrating Panther armor at combat ranges beyond 500 meters. This round had come from at least 1,200 meters away, and it had punched through his tank's armor like paper. Klaus slammed his fist against the turret intercom. "Reverse! Full reverse now!" His driver, Unteroffizier Hans Weber, a veteran who had been with him since Kharkov, needed no further encouragement. The Panther's Maybach engine screamed as it threw the 45-ton vehicle backward into the tree line they had just emerged from. 2 more cracks echoed across the snow-covered field. One round sailed overhead with a sound like tearing canvas. The other struck the frozen ground where they had been positioned 3 seconds earlier, sending up a geyser of dirt and ice. "Commander, what was that?" Weber's voice crackled through the intercom, steadier than it had any right to be. "That penetrated our frontal armor. From that distance, nothing the Americans have should do that." Klaus pressed his eye to the periscope, scanning the far tree line where the shots had originated. Through the gray winter haze, he could just make out a low profile, angular and unfamiliar. It was smaller than a Sherman, with a more pronounced slope to its armor. As he watched, the vehicle shifted position with surprising speed, its tracks churning through the snow as it repositioned to a new firing angle. "I don't know what it is," Klaus admitted, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "But we need to report this immediately. Whatever the Americans have brought to this sector, it's nothing like what we were briefed on." The German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge had begun just 3 days earlier, on December 16, 1944. Adolf Hitler had gambled everything on one last desperate thrust through the Ardennes, hoping to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. The plan relied heavily on speed, surprise, and the supposed superiority of German armor. Panther and Tiger tanks would lead the breakthrough, overwhelming the thinly spread American defensive lines before winter weather grounded Allied air superiority. The intelligence assessments provided to German tank commanders like Klaus had been thorough, or so they believed. Based on combat reports from Normandy and the fighting across France, German military intelligence had cataloged American armored capabilities with what appeared to be comprehensive detail. The Sherman tank, in all its variants, was considered dangerous in numbers, but individually inferior to German medium tanks. The M4 Sherman's 75mm gun could not reliably penetrate Panther frontal armor at any practical combat range. Even the newer Sherman models with 76mm guns, encountered in increasing numbers since August, required close range and precise shot placement to threaten a Panther. American tank destroyers were assessed as even less threatening in direct combat. The M10 Wolverine, with its open-topped turret and relatively thin armor, had been encountered throughout the summer campaigns. While its 3-inch gun was respectable, it fired at lower velocities than dedicated anti-tank guns and was considered most effective in ambush situations against lighter German vehicles. The M18 Hellcat, faster but more lightly armored, carried a 76mm gun identical to the late-model Shermans. Intelligence reports noted its speed as its primary asset, useful for flanking maneuvers but vulnerable in direct engagements. Nowhere in these briefings was there mention of an American tank destroyer mounting a gun capable of penetrating 80mm of sloped armor at ranges exceeding a kilometer. The weapon that had just torn through Klaus Steiner's Panther was not supposed to exist, at least not in the hands of the Americans, and certainly not deployed in the Ardennes in numbers sufficient to matter. What Klaus had encountered was the M36 Jackson, a tank destroyer mounting the fearsome 90mm M3 gun, the same weapon used on the M26 Pershing heavy tank. The M36 had only begun reaching frontline units in October 1944, and American commanders had deployed them selectively, holding back detailed information about their capabilities. German intelligence had noted rumors of a new American tank destroyer, but had dismissed reports of its 90mm gun as exaggeration or confusion with the 90mm anti-aircraft guns that were occasionally used in ground roles. This intelligence failure was about to cost the German armored forces dearly. By the evening of December 19th, Klaus and his crew had rejoined the main body of their battle group near La Glaise. The Panther's frontal armor had been penetrated, but by some miracle, the round had not struck any critical systems or crew members. The shot had entered at an angle that sent it through the radio equipment and out through the thinner side armor, leaving a ton of devastated metal but a functional tank. Klaus had ordered his crew to weld a metal plate over the entry hole and redistribute ammunition to balance the weight. They were combat effective again, but the psychological wound ran deeper than the physical one. In the company commander's half-track, Klaus delivered his after-action report to Hauptmann Ernst Dietrich, a career officer who had commanded armor since the Polish campaign in 1939. Dietrich listened with increasing concern as Klaus described the engagement, the distance, the penetration, and the unfamiliar silhouette of the American vehicle. "You're certain it wasn't one of their tank destroyers we already know about?" Dietrich asked, his weathered face illuminated by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. Outside, the sounds of the division regrouping echoed through the cold night. Engines roared, tracks clanked, and officers shouted orders as the offensive's timetable continued to slip further behind schedule. "Absolutely certain, Herr Hauptmann," Klaus replied. "The profile was wrong, lower, more angular, and no 76mm gun we've encountered could achieve that penetration at that range. The Americans have deployed something new, something we weren't warned about." Dietrich pulled out a map and marked the location of the engagement. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. You're the third commander to report something similar today. Lieutenant Becker's Panzer IV was knocked out this morning north of your position. Complete penetration through the turret front at what he estimates was over 800 meters. He lost his gunner and loader. Oberfeldwebel Koch reported a near miss from an unknown high-velocity weapon near Stavelot that left a crater in the road surface half a meter deep. The captain pulled out a battered notebook and flipped through pages of handwritten reports. The pattern is clear. The Americans have deployed a new tank destroyer with a significantly more powerful gun than anything we've previously encountered. The question is how many they have and whether this is a local concentration or a general deployment across the front. Klaus leaned over the map, studying the marked positions. "If they have enough of these vehicles to cover multiple sectors, Herr Hauptmann, our advance is going to be much more costly than planned. The Panther's frontal armor has been our guarantee of tactical superiority. If the Americans can now penetrate it at long range, we've lost our primary advantage." What neither Klaus nor Captain Dietrich knew at that moment was the full scope of American M36 deployment. The U.S. Army had received its first M36 tank destroyers in September 1944, and by December, over 300 were in service in the European theater. While this was a relatively small number compared to the thousands of Shermans and hundreds of M10 and 18 tank destroyers, the M36s had been distributed strategically to units expected to face heavy German armor. Several M36-equipped tank destroyer battalions had been positioned in or near the Ardennes, precisely where German intelligence had predicted the American line would be weakest. The 90mm M3 gun mounted on the M36 was a formidable weapon, derived from the 90mm anti-aircraft gun but optimized for anti-tank work. It fired a 24-pound armor-piercing round at a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, significantly faster than the 76mm gun's 2,600 feet per second. This higher velocity translated directly into greater penetrating power. At 1,000 meters, the M36's 90mm gun could penetrate approximately 170 millimeters of vertical armor, more than sufficient to defeat the Panther's 80mm frontal plate, even accounting for its sloped angle. The psychological impact of this capability would prove as important as the physical one. German tank doctrine had been built around the confidence that Panthers and Tigers were effectively invulnerable from the front at medium to long ranges. This assumption allowed German commanders to take calculated risks, to advance across open ground when necessary, and to trade space for time, knowing their armor could absorb punishment that would destroy enemy vehicles. The M36 shattered this calculus entirely. Over the following days, as the German offensive ground forward against stiffening American resistance, reports of encounters with the mysterious new American tank destroyer multiplied. On December 20th, near Monhai, a platoon of 4 Panthers from the 2nd SS Panzer Division attempted to force a crossroads held by a mixed American force. 3 of the Panthers were knocked out in rapid succession from a range of approximately 900 meters, with all 3 suffering frontal penetrations that German tank commanders had considered impossible from American weapons. The 4th Panther withdrew, its commander reporting that the American fire was coming from a vehicle he could barely distinguish in the tree line, firing with a rapidity and accuracy that suggested a very experienced crew. On December 21st, near Hotten, Oberleutnant Friedrich Kessler, commanding a Tiger I heavy tank, found himself in the unprecedented situation of being outranged by an American armored vehicle. Kessler had become accustomed to the Tiger's 88mm gun, giving him a significant reach advantage over any American tank or tank destroyer. The Tiger could reliably engage and destroy Shermans at ranges where return fire was ineffective. Against the M36, Kessler discovered this advantage had evaporated. An American tank destroyer engaged his Tiger from an estimated 1,400 meters, a range at which Kessler could barely distinguish the target. The first American round missed by less than 2 meters. The second struck the Tiger's frontal armor with sufficient force to crack the plate, though it did not achieve full penetration. Kessler, recognizing he was in a duel he could not win, withdrew behind a ridgeline and repositioned to a new route of advance. For the first time in this war, Kessler wrote in his personal diary that evening, "I felt what American and British tank crews must have felt facing us. The sense of being outgunned, of facing a weapon that could destroy me before I could effectively engage. It was not a sensation I ever expected to experience in a Tiger tank." As Christmas approached and the German offensive began to stall, slowed by fierce American resistance, supply shortages, and clearing weather that brought Allied aircraft back into action, the psychological impact of the M36 encounters rippled through the German armored forces. Tank commanders who had operated with aggressive confidence now approached advances with greater caution. The standing order to utilize the Panther's superior frontal armor by advancing directly toward enemy positions had to be reconsidered. Flanking maneuvers and the use of terrain for cover became more critical, slowing the pace of advance and consuming precious fuel. Klaus Steiner's company fought through the final days of December in a very different manner than they had begun the offensive. Where previously they had led advances across open ground, confident in their armor, they now moved with the caution of men who knew they could be destroyed at long range by an enemy they might not even see. Every tree line became a potential ambush site. Every distant shadow might hide an M36 with its deadly 90mm gun.
On December 26th, Klaus was ordered to lead a reconnaissance in force toward Monhai, attempting to identify American positions and strength. His platoon of 4 Panthers advanced slowly through rolling terrain, using every fold in the ground for cover, stopping frequently to scan ahead with binoculars before proceeding. The advance that would have taken 30 minutes in October now consumed 3 hours. This is what the Americans and British must have felt in Normandy, his gunner, Feldwebel Otto Zimmermann, observed over the intercom, always waiting for the shot that could end you, never quite confident in your armor. Klaus nodded, though none of his crew could see the gesture in the cramped tank interior. The difference, Odo, is that we have nowhere to go but forward, and no time to adapt. The Americans learned to fight Tigers and Panthers over months of combat. We have days, maybe weeks, before this offensive collapses entirely. And we're learning that our supposed superiority was always more fragile than we believed. The reconnaissance mission ended abruptly when an M36, concealed in a destroyed barn 1,100 meters ahead, placed a 90mm round between Klaus's Panther and the tank following 50 meters behind. The round struck the frozen ground and ricocheted upward, missing both vehicles, but demonstrating that the American crew had them ranged and could fire at will. Klaus immediately ordered withdrawal, and the platoon retreated without attempting to engage. The bitter truth was that attempting to duel an M36 at that range was simply suicide. That evening, gathered around a small fire in a captured farmhouse, Klaus and several other tank commanders shared their experiences. The conversation was markedly different from the confident discussions of a week earlier. Lieutenant Hans Meyer, whose Panther had been struck 3 times by M36 fire over the past 5 days, though fortunately without catastrophic damage, summed up the prevailing mood with brutal honesty. "We were told the Americans had adequate armor, but nothing exceptional. We were assured our Panthers and Tigers gave us technological superiority that would translate into battlefield dominance. Instead, we find ourselves facing a vehicle that can destroy us at ranges where we can barely acquire the target, mounted on a chassis fast enough to relocate before we can coordinate artillery."
How do we fight when the fundamental assumptions we were given are wrong? No one had a satisfactory answer. The tactical adaptations they had developed, using terrain more carefully, advancing in shorter bounds with better overwatch, coordinating more closely with infantry to clear potential ambush sites, these helped reduce casualties but also slowed operations to a crawl. The entire German offensive had been premised on rapid breakthrough and exploitation. Cautious, methodical advances were exactly what they could not afford. Klaus stared into the fire, thinking about the hole punched through his Panther's armor on December 19th, 7 days ago, though it felt like a lifetime. "The worst part," he said quietly, "is knowing that if our intelligence was this wrong about American tank destroyer capabilities, what else were they wrong about? Their artillery? Their air power? Their industrial capacity? We've been fighting this war based on assessments that told us what we wanted to hear, not what was true." The room fell silent. It was one thing to acknowledge tactical surprises on the battlefield. It was something else entirely to question the fundamental intelligence picture that shaped strategic decisions. Yet, as the German offensive ground to a halt in the final days of December 1944, unable to achieve any of its objectives, the evidence became impossible to ignore. The Americans were not the technologically inferior enemy that German propaganda and intelligence briefings had portrayed. They were adapting, innovating, and deploying weapon systems that matched or exceeded German capabilities. The M36 Jackson, with its 90mm gun, was simply the most visible and immediate symbol of this reality. But it represented something larger and more troubling for the German armored forces. It demonstrated that American industry could not only produce vast quantities of equipment, but could also rapidly develop and field advanced systems in response to battlefield requirements. The M36 had gone from concept to deployment in less than a year, a pace of innovation that the increasingly resource-starved German war machine could no longer match. As 1944 gave way to 1945, Klaus Steiner and his fellow tank commanders would continue to fight, their skill and determination undiminished even as their confidence in their equipment's superiority eroded. The Panther was still a formidable tank, the Tiger still a powerful weapon. But they were no longer invincible, and the crews who operated them could no longer take for granted that their armor would protect them from frontal engagement.
The Americans had closed the technological gap, and in the case of the M36's gun, had arguably surpassed it. The crack of that 90mm gun on a frozen December morning near Stoumont had announced more than just the arrival of a new weapon system. It had shattered the comfortable certainty that German armor technology remained supreme. And with that certainty went much of the psychological advantage that had sustained German armored forces through years of increasingly desperate combat. The sound of American 90mm rounds punching through supposedly impenetrable armor would echo through the remaining months of the war, a constant reminder that the tide had turned not just in numbers but in capability. The intelligence reassessment came too late to change anything. By early January 1945, as the German offensive collapsed and Allied forces began their counterattack, Wehrmacht intelligence finally compiled a comprehensive report on the M36 Jackson tank destroyer. The document, stamped with urgent priority markings and distributed to armor commanders across the Western Front, confirmed what men like Klaus Steiner had learned through bitter experience. The Americans had fielded a tank destroyer mounting a 90mm high-velocity gun capable of defeating Panther and Tiger armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The report estimated over 300 such vehicles were now operational in the European theater, with production continuing at American factories. By the time this information reached frontline units, dozens of German tanks had already been destroyed by weapons their crews believed didn't exist. Hauptmann Ernst Dietrich read the intelligence summary in his command post near St. Vith on January 8, 1945, and felt a familiar bitterness rising in his throat. The report contained technical specifications, combat performance data, and tactical recommendations that would have been invaluable 3 weeks earlier. Now it served primarily as official confirmation of lessons already written in burned-out Panthers and dead tank crews scattered across the Belgian countryside. He called his surviving platoon leaders together that evening to review the document and discuss revised tactical doctrine. Klaus Steiner arrived at the meeting with 3 other officers, all that remained of the company that had numbered 12 tanks when the offensive began. The others had been knocked out, broken down, or abandoned when fuel ran out during the chaotic retreat. The small group gathered around a table made from an old door laid across 2 ammunition crates, studying the intelligence report by lamplight while outside a cold rain fell steadily, turning the roads to mud and making resupply nearly impossible. "The gun is derived from their 90mm anti-aircraft weapon," Dietrich read aloud, his finger tracing down the typed pages. "Muzzle velocity of 850 meters per second, firing a projectile weighing nearly 11 kilograms. Penetration capability of 170 millimeters of vertical armor at 1,000 meters. The vehicle itself is based on the Sherman chassis, with the hull modified to accept a larger turret. Armor protection is modest, maximum 108 millimeters on the gun mantlet, only 38 millimeters on the hull sides. Crew of 5, maximum speed 42 kilometers per hour on roads." Lieutenant Hans Meyer, whose Panther now bore the scars of 3 separate M36 impacts, studied the specifications with the intensity of a man trying to find weakness in an enemy that had bested him repeatedly. "The armor is thin," he observed, "thinner than a Panzer IV in most places. If we can hit them, they die easily. The problem is hitting them first." "That is precisely the problem," Dietrich agreed. "The M36 is designed to engage from long range and relocate quickly. It doesn't need heavy armor because its tactical doctrine emphasizes standoff engagement and mobility. By the time we identify their position and return fire, they've moved, and at the ranges where they're vulnerable to our guns, we are already in their killing zone." Klaus spread out a hand-drawn map showing M36 engagement positions recorded over the past 3 weeks. The pattern was clear and depressingly consistent. Most encounters occurred at ranges between 800 and 1,400 meters, with the American tank destroyers positioned in concealment that offered good fields of fire across open approaches. In nearly every case, the M36 scored first, and in most instances, the German tanks either withdrew or were destroyed before achieving hits on the American vehicle. Of 17 confirmed M36 engagements recorded by the company, German forces had destroyed exactly 2 of the American tank destroyers, both at ranges under 400 meters when the M36s had been caught in close terrain or had remained in position too long. "Their crews are well trained," Klaus noted, pointing to several locations where M36s had fired and displaced within minutes. They understand their vehicle's strengths and limitations. They're not trying to brawl with us. They take long-range shots, usually no more than 3 or 4, then relocate before we can coordinate a response. It's textbook tank destroyer doctrine, and it's devastatingly effective when they have the gun to back it up. Oberleutnant Werner Schmidt, the youngest officer present at 24 and the newest to the company, asked the question they were all thinking.
So, how do we fight them? We can't avoid combat, we can't outrange them, and we can't rely on our armor to protect us anymore. What's left? The room fell quiet. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming on the roof of the farmhouse they'd commandeered. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, though whether German or American was impossible to tell. Dietrich finally broke the silence with the pragmatic assessment of a career officer who had seen too many tactical situations deteriorate into strategic disasters. "We adapt or we die," he said flatly. "First, we abandon the assumption that Panther frontal armor makes us invulnerable. Every advance must be planned with the understanding that we can be destroyed from the front at long range. That means better use of terrain, smoke when available, coordinated movement with infantry to clear positions before we expose ourselves. Second, we need to identify M36 positions before engaging. That means better reconnaissance, more patience, accepting that advances will be slower. Third, when we do engage, we concentrate fire. One Panther trading shots with an M36 at 1,000 meters will lose. 4 Panthers firing simultaneously give us better odds." Klaus nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in the approach even as he understood its limitations. "This works defensively, Herr Hauptmann, but we're still nominally on the offensive. Or we're supposed to be. These tactics you describe are what you use when you're trying not to lose, not when you're trying to win." "Then it's fortunate," Dietrich replied with grim humor, "that we are no longer trying to win this offensive. We're trying to survive it and preserve enough combat power to defend the Reich when the Americans and British launch their inevitable spring offensive. The Ardennes gamble failed. Now we pay the price for that failure, and part of that price is learning humility regarding our equipment's capabilities." The tactical adaptations that men like Dietrich and Klaus developed through January and into February 1945 represented a fundamental shift in German armored doctrine. For years, German tank tactics had emphasized aggressive action, exploiting the qualitative superiority of vehicles like the Panther and Tiger to achieve breakthrough and exploitation. The arrival of the M36, capable of defeating German heavy armor at long range, forced a return to more cautious, methodical approaches that had characterized earlier periods of the war when German tanks faced rough parity with their opponents. This shift had consequences beyond individual engagements. Fuel shortages, already critical, became even more severe as units maneuvered more extensively to avoid exposure. Ammunition consumption increased as tanks fired more suppressive rounds to cover movement or to force M36s to displace. Operational tempo slowed dramatically, turning what were supposed to be rapid advances into grinding, attritional struggles, where every kilometer gained cost vehicles, fuel, and time that German forces could not afford to lose. Klaus experienced this new reality firsthand during a defensive action near Vilsholm on January 17th. His platoon of 3 Panthers was tasked with holding a crossroads against an expected American probe. Intelligence suggested a company of Shermans supported by infantry, a force his platoon should theoretically be able to handle, if not defeat outright. What arrived instead was a mixed force including at least 2 M36 tank destroyers providing overwatch for advancing Shermans. The engagement began at 8:30 hours, with American artillery preparation that was brief but intense, a 5-minute bombardment that forced Klaus and his crews to button up and wait it out. When the artillery lifted, Klaus cautiously raised his head to scan through the periscope, expecting to see Shermans advancing across the open ground toward his position. Instead, he saw nothing. The field remained empty. Morning fog still clinging to the low areas, trees at the far end shrouded in mist and smoke from the artillery barrage. "Where are they?" his gunner asked over the intercom, mirroring Klaus's confusion. Standard American doctrine called for infantry and armor to advance quickly after artillery preparation, taking advantage of the suppressive effect while defenders were still disoriented. The empty field suggested either the attack had been canceled or the Americans were trying something different. The answer came 90 seconds later, when a 90mm round struck the Panther positioned 80 meters to Klaus's left. The round hit low on the glacis plate, penetrating and detonating the ammunition stored in the hull. The Panther exploded with shocking violence, its turret lifting 3 meters into the air before crashing back down onto the burning hull. Klaus's vision was still recovering from the flash when a second round passed less than 2 meters over his own turret, the supersonic crack making his ears ring even through the thick steel. "Reverse! Full reverse, now!" Klaus shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. The Panther lurched backward into the prepared fallback position, a hull down spot 50 meters behind their original line, where only the turret would be exposed. Through his periscope, Klaus desperately scanned for the source of the fire, finally spotting muzzle flash from the tree line 1,100 meters distant, partially obscured by lingering fog and smoke. "Where are they?" his gunner asked over the intercom, mirroring Klaus's confusion. Standard American doctrine called for infantry and armor to advance quickly after artillery preparation, taking advantage of the suppressive effect while defenders were still disoriented. The empty field suggested either the attack had been canceled or the Americans were trying something different. The answer came 90 seconds later, when a 90mm round struck the Panther positioned 80 meters to Klaus's left. The round hit low on the glacis plate, penetrating and detonating the ammunition stored in the hull. The Panther exploded with shocking violence, its turret lifting 3 meters into the air before crashing back down onto the burning hull. Klaus's vision was still recovering from the flash when a second round passed less than 2 meters over his own turret, the supersonic crack making his ears ring even through the thick steel. "Reverse! Full reverse now!" Klaus shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. The Panther lurched backward into the prepared fallback position, a hull down spot 50 meters behind their original line, where only the turret would be exposed. Through his periscope, Klaus desperately scanned for the source of the fire, finally spotting muzzle flash from the tree line 1,100 meters distant, partially obscured by lingering fog and smoke. "Target? Trees at 2 o'clock, approximately 1,100 meters. Can you acquire?" "Negative, Commander. Too much obscuration. I have the general area, but no clear target." Before Klaus could respond, the 3rd Panther in his platoon, commanded by Unteroffizier Paul Richter, fired toward the American position. The 75mm shell struck trees well short of the target, exploding harmlessly in the forest canopy. Return fire came almost immediately, an M36 round that hit Richter's Panther in the turret side as it began to reverse, penetrating the thinner armor and killing the gunner and loader instantly. Richter managed to extract his driver and himself through the escape hatches, but the Panther was finished as a fighting vehicle. Klaus found himself in command of the only functional tank at a position they were ordered to hold, facing at least 2 M36 tank destroyers that could engage him with impunity while he struggled to even locate them through the obscuration. The tactical situation was untenable. Any movement would expose his Panther to devastating fire from an enemy he couldn't effectively engage. Remaining in place meant waiting to be destroyed as the Americans systematically ranged in on his position. "Commander, we need to withdraw," his driver urged over the intercom. "We can't fight what we can't see, and they clearly have us located." Klaus knew Weber was right. Every instinct screamed at him to reverse out of the position, fall back to the secondary defensive line, preserve his tank and crew to fight another day. But the orders were explicit. Hold this crossroads.
Delay the American advance. Buy time for units farther back to prepare defenses. Abandoning the position without authorization meant court-martial, possibly execution, given how desperate the situation had become. The Wehrmacht was no longer tolerant of commanders who retreated without orders, no matter how sensible the tactical decision. "Radio battalion," Klaus ordered his radio operator. "Inform them we've lost 2 tanks to long-range fire from American tank destroyers with superior armament. Position is untenable without infantry support to clear enemy observation posts. Request permission to execute fallback to secondary line." The response took 7 agonizing minutes to arrive, during which Klaus watched the fog slowly lift and expected each moment to bring another 90mm round smashing into his position. When the radio finally crackled with battalion's reply, the answer was predictable and infuriating. Hold position. Infantry support being coordinated. Reinforcement en route. Estimate 2 hours. End message. 2 hours might as well have been 2 days. Klaus had no illusions about surviving that long against M36s that had already demonstrated they could destroy Panthers at will from concealed positions. The American tank destroyers would systematically eliminate any German armor at the crossroads long before friendly infantry arrived to threaten their positions. Yet, orders were orders, and in early 1945, disobeying orders meant a bullet from your own side if enemy fire didn't kill you first. What saved Klaus that morning was not German reinforcements, but American tactical priorities. The M36s maintained overwatch for another 20 minutes, during which Klaus kept his Panther in hull-down position and didn't fire, offering no muzzle flash or movement to draw their attention. Then the American infantry and Shermans began their advance, emerging from the fog in a skirmish line that suggested they intended to assault the crossroads directly. The M36s displaced forward to maintain their overwatch role, giving Klaus brief glimpses of their profiles as they moved between positions. Target: tank destroyer, 900 meters, moving left to right, Klaus called to his gunner. Lead him, fire when ready. The Panther's 75mm gun barked, the round catching the M36 just as it slowed to take position behind a stone wall. The hit was on the thin side armor at an oblique angle, but at 900 meters, the Panther's gun still had sufficient energy to penetrate. The M36 shuddered, smoke beginning to pour from engine hatches, and the crew bailed out rapidly, running for cover as the vehicle burned. It was Klaus's first confirmed kill against an M36, but there was no time to celebrate. American infantry was now only 400 meters from his position, and at least one more M36 was operating somewhere in the area. Klaus radioed battalion again, reporting the situation and requesting immediate permission to withdraw before being overrun. This time, the response was faster and more sensible. Permission granted. Fall back to secondary line. Good luck. The Panther reversed out of position and made its escape, using every bit of terrain and the last wisps of morning fog as concealment. American fire followed them, but at extended range and through obscuration, none of the shots connected. Klaus and his crew reached the secondary defensive line, bruised, exhausted, and shaken, but alive. Behind them, the crossroads they'd been ordered to hold fell to American forces within 30 minutes. The 2-hour delay Klaus had bought with 2 destroyed Panthers and 1 damaged vehicle was ultimately meaningless in the larger scheme of the battle, but it represented the grinding reality of defensive combat in early 1945. That evening, filling out his after-action report in smudged pencil on salvaged paper, Klaus tried to articulate the tactical lessons from the engagement. His conclusions were bleak but honest. Panther armor, once our guarantee of survivability, no longer provides protection against American M36 tank destroyers at combat ranges. Enemy demonstrates superior ability to engage from concealment at extended range. Our 75mm gun lacks effective range and accuracy to consistently threaten M36 positions at distances where they can destroy us. Recommended doctrine is to avoid direct engagement when possible, utilize terrain and obscuration, coordinate with infantry and artillery to neutralize M36 before committing armor. Current tactical situation places us at significant disadvantage in open terrain engagements. Similar reports flowed up through the German chain of command throughout January and February 1945 as the Wehrmacht retreated from the Ardennes and prepared to defend German soil against the coming Allied offensives. The cumulative weight of these tactical assessments painted a troubling picture. German armor, which had begun the war with decisive technological and tactical advantages, had gradually seen those advantages erode through Allied innovation and industrial capacity. The M36 represented perhaps the final major reversal, the point at which American armor capabilities achieved rough parity or superiority in the critical category of anti-tank firepower. For tank commanders like Klaus, who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts, the implications extended beyond tactical considerations.
The M36's 90mm gun was evidence of American industrial sophistication that German propaganda had insisted didn't exist. If the Americans could rapidly develop and deploy such capable weapons while also producing them in meaningful quantities, what did that say about all the other assumptions German forces had operated under? Their air superiority, their artillery capabilities, their logistics, every category where Germans had been assured of superiority or at least parity now seemed suspect. These doubts, shared privately among officers who trusted each other enough to voice dangerous thoughts, represented a deeper demoralization than simple combat fatigue. Fighting against superior numbers was one thing. German forces had done that before and sometimes prevailed through skill and determination. Fighting against superior numbers backed by superior equipment and industrial capacity was something else entirely. It suggested that the war's outcome had been inevitable regardless of individual courage or tactical excellence, that all the sacrifice and bloodshed had been in pursuit of an impossible goal. Klaus articulated this feeling in a letter to his wife that he never sent, written in early February during a brief lull in the fighting. We were told that German engineering and fighting spirit would overcome American material advantages, that quality would triumph over quantity. The M36 tank destroyer has taught us the uncomfortable truth that Americans can have both quality and quantity when they choose to apply their resources. We cannot match this, not now, perhaps not ever, given our current situation. I wonder if we ever could have, or if we were simply fortunate early in the war to face enemies who were unprepared and disorganized. Now we face enemies who have learned, adapted, and surpassed us in critical areas. The sound of a 90mm round penetrating Panther armor is the sound of illusions shattering. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.